Centuries ago, the Ottoman Empire dazzled the world with its towering minarets, bustling bazaars, and unmatched military power. But behind the grandeur of its golden domes and calligraphic beauty, a chilling truth was written not in ink, but in blood, silence, and vanished names. This isn't just about scandalous legends or dark corners of forgotten palaces. What you're about to uncover isn't myth. It's policy state engineered, meticulously recorded, and brutally enforced. Welcome to the empire, where power turned human intimacy into law, where bodies both male and female were not just commodities, but instruments of statecraft. The Ottomans didn't simply conquer territories, they colonized the human soul. What if I told you that children were taken from their homes, not as spoils of war, but as entries in government ledgers, that boys as young as 7 were assessed, measured, and assigned roles, some to the battlefield, some to the bedchamber, based not on merit or choice, but on their beauty. And what about the women? The infamous harem wasn't a paradise of silk and pleasure. It was a prison where survival meant seduction, where sisterhood was crushed by forced competition, and where aging was a death sentence whispered behind velvet curtains. These systems weren't hidden. They were written into the very fabric of the empire, detailed in inventories, letters between bureaucrats, and official treaties. This was not isolated cruelty. It was a machine of exploitation, operated by scholars, sultans, merchants, and eunuchs alike. In this video, we pull back the curtain on the most terrifying sexual policies of the Ottoman state, from the blood tax known as devshirme, to the castration camps of the eunuch trade, to the silent erasure of the so-called bunny boys who were swallowed by the palace and never seen again. We'll examine how the state normalized rape, slavery, and gender manipulation, how entire generations grew up seeing bodies sold like silk, and how the line between justice and spectacle blurred as executions turned into public festivals. But perhaps most haunting of all these were not the actions of a few bad men in secret rooms. These were rituals of empire, designed to endure, justified by religion, and funded by gold. So, stay with us, because understanding this is not just about the Ottoman Empire. It's about how any civilization, no matter how magnificent, can fall when it turns people into tools, désir into law, and silence into order. Next, we begin at the root, the child levy, a policy so normalized. It turned Christian villages into recruitment fields, and children into forgotten weapons. It began with a knock at the door. Not the clatter of invading soldiers or the chaos of pillaged towns, but something quieter, more precise. Ottoman officials arrived in well-organized processions, ledgers in hand, escorted by janissaries, and guarded not just by swords, but by imperial decree. This was no raid. It was a collection from the late 14th century through the 17th. The Ottoman Empire institutionalized what would become one of the most chilling systems of forced assimilation the world had ever seen. It was called devshirme, literally, of the collection. But the people knew it by another name, the blood tax. Christian boys, mostly from the Balkans, Albania, Bosnia, Serbia, and Greece, were seized from their families every few years. It wasn't random. It was methodical. Inspectors walked through mountain villages, reading lists drawn up by local authorities under Ottoman command, house by house, child by child. They judged who would be taken. The chosen ones were typically between the ages of 7 and 14, too young to fight back, old enough to forget. A mother might beg, a father might hide a son in the forest, but refusal meant punishment, resistance meant ruin. And so, year after year, Families stood helpless as their children were marched away in silence. They were told the boys would be given a future, an education, a noble career, perhaps even a place beside the Sultan himself. But the reality was far more brutal. These boys were stripped of everything: their language, their religion, their names. Within months, they could no longer remember how to say mother in their own tongue. Those deemed physically strong were trained to become janissaries, the elite fighting force of the empire. But there was a price. To ensure loyalty to the Sultan above all, they were forbidden to marry, own property, or have children. Many were castrated. Their bloodline ended the moment they were taken. Others, those with striking features, fair skin, symmetrical faces, were marked for a different path. They were sent into the palace, not to wield swords, but to serve as eunuchs, concubines, or entertainers. Their beauty became their prison, and their survival depended not on strength, but on obedience. The devshirm was not a temporary policy. It lasted for nearly 3 centuries. Generations of Balkan families were hollowed out. Entire lineages disappeared into the empire's machinery, never to be heard from again. Some boys did rise to power. Some became grand viziers, governors, or commanders. But even then, their success was built on a foundation of erased identity. They could never return home. They had no home to return to. The empire had taken not just their bodies, but their past. And yet, this system was praised in Ottoman chronicles as efficient. Even divine, religious scholars justified it. Economists recorded its profitability. Sultans relied on it to keep their armies loyal and their enemies disarmed. It wasn't called slavery. It was called service. It wasn't treated as cruelty. It was treated as order, and perhaps most disturbingly, it wasn't a secret. In the next part, we descend deeper into the palace itself, where silence was currency. And the most beautiful boys faced a fate worse than war. Not every boy taken by the Ottoman state was destined for the battlefield. Some, upon first glance, were considered too delicate, too symmetrical, too beautiful to die with a sword in their hands. Their fate would be determined not by strength, but by skin tone, by eye shape, by the arbitrary standards of aesthetic value set not by artists, but by courtiers and surgeons, men whose gaze was trained not to see children, but commodities. These boys were separated early, long before they could understand what was happening, and were sent not to barracks, but to distant provinces, outposts of quiet horror where the real transformation would begin. There, in shadowed clinics run by men with steady hands and cold instructions, the process of turning boys into eunuchs commenced. The procedures were brutal, often fatal. Some operations involved complete removal, others partial mutilation, depending on the boy's skin color and what role he was meant to play. African boys were most often subjected to the full procedure, and if they survived, they were transported to Constantinople, where they became black eunuchs, trusted to guard the inner chambers of the palace, protect the Sultan's wives, and oversee the daily mechanics of the harem, all while living in permanent solitude, stripped of the capacity to form a family, to love freely, or even to remember who they were before their transformation. European boys, usually from the Balkans, were more often partially castrated and assigned to the administrative wings of the empire, where they served as intermediaries between rulers, clerks, and noble households. To outsiders, these eunuchs might appear powerful, even respected, but that perception blurred the more agonizing truth: they were trusted because they had been broken, loyal, not out of choice, but because there was no life to return to. But there was a third path, one rarely spoken aloud, even in Ottoman records. It was reserved for the most physically graceful boys, those whose movements could be trained into mimicry, whose eyes carried a softness that could be exaggerated, whose voices had not yet deepened. These were the boys selected to become kochek, or palace dansé, draped in silk, painted with rouge and powder. They were taught to move like women, not for art, but for arousal. They were paraded at feasts, festivals, and secretive court gatherings, where the line between performance and possession dissolved within minutes. At first, they were expected only to dance flutes played. Drums beat a hypnotic rhythm, and the boys twirled, their thin bodies shimmering under candlelight. But soon the crowd grew louder, more excited, and inevitably more violent. Guests, drunk on wine and privilege, would fight over them, touch them, pull at their clothes. The dancers, just children, had no recourse, no guardians, no allies in the room. Their fear was part of the spectacle. Their silence was demanded. Their violation was expected. Worse still, their identities were annihilated by contradiction. They were dressed as women but called boys. They were forbidden to be men but never allowed to be anything else. In a society obsessed with rigid gender roles, they existed outside all categories, not seen as human beings but as fantasies made flesh. They belonged nowhere and to no one. And when they aged, when their features changed, when they no longer delighted the men who once applauded them, they were discarded. Some were quietly executed. Others simply disappeared from the records. Their stories were not written. Their names were not remembered. Their graves, if they existed at all, were unmarked. And yet, this too was not an aberration. It was not hidden, nor disapproved. It was celebrated in music, normalized in poetry, and whispered about with indulgent curiosity by the upper classes, who saw no scandal in using children as decoration and desire. The state did not merely allow this, it enabled it, funded it, choreographed it. These boys were not victims of rogue cruelty. They were subjects of a system that turned innocence into entertainment, and silence into survival. Next, we uncover the most disturbing layer of all the Bunny Boys' children so secret. Their very existence was erased from memory, hidden in the Sultan's private chambers, where no law could reach, and no whisper could escape. They were never supposed to exist. Unlike the Janissaries, whose strength fed the empire's armies, or the eunuchs, whose silence served the palace. The Bunny Boys were not part of any formal rank or bureaucratic title. Their names never appeared in the imperial ledgers. Their faces were never drawn in official portraits. Their lives were not documented in the flow of Ottoman history, not because they were forgotten, but because they were deliberately erased. The Bunny Boys, a chilling euphemism, whispered in darkened halls, were children taken outside the reach of record, recruited not for state service, but for private indulgence, selected for their youth, their beauty, their pliability. These boys were brought into the innermost sanctums of power, the private quarters of high-ranking officials, governors, pashas, and sometimes even the Sultan himself. Here, behind the most guarded walls of the Topkapi Palace or provincial mansions, they became ghosts in velvet rooms, seen only by the men who claimed ownership over them, and never again by the world beyond. What made the fate of the Bunny Boys even more terrifying than that of the dancers or the eunuchs was the total absence of law. There were no titles to protect them, no protocols governing their treatment. They were not slaves in the legal sense, because slaves were at least counted. They were not soldiers or officials, because those had defined duties. The Bunny Boys existed entirely outside the system, which meant they had no rights, no status, no path out. Once taken, They ceased to be citizens. Children, or even captives, they simply vanished. Their families were never notified. There were no letters, no rumors. No second-hand reports passed through frightened villagers or bribed guards. Once a bunny boy was taken, he became a secret held behind a smile, his past smothered, his future predetermined, his suffering buried in opulence and shame. Parents, left behind in rural towns or coastal villages, waited for years. Some kept a room ready. Some lit candles on birthdays. But most grew old and died without ever knowing that their sons had not died in war or illness or accident, but were instead alive, somewhere in the imperial shadow, alive but unfree, alive but unseen. And what happened behind those locked doors historians tread carefully here, not for lack of evidence, but because what evidence remains is unspeakable. Fragments of journals, letters confiscated by European ambassadors, and whispers from escaped attendants speak of boys forced into silence through threat and ceremony. Some were dressed in costumes and made to serve at night. Others were kept in silence for so long that they forgot how to speak. Some were beaten for crying. Some were rewarded for compliance. All of them were punished for growing up, because that was the final cruelty the bunny boys were not meant to age. Their very existence was a fantasy built on childhood, and when time betrayed them, when their bodies began to change, the illusion crumbled, and with it, so did their value. What became of them then, no one knows. There are no graves, no names, no trials, only a pattern of disappearance that points to one terrifying conclusion: they were disposed of as quietly as they were taken. And yet, for centuries, this system thrived, not despite the empire's power, but because of it. The most powerful men in the Ottoman world could command armies, alter laws, and sign treaties, but their truest dominion was over bodies no one else would miss. The bunny boys were the ultimate expression of that dominion, a silence so complete, it became sacred. In the next chapter, we turn our gaze to the women of the empire, not as legends of the harem, but as victims and survivors of a golden cage built from competition, betrayal, and the currency of youth. To the outsider, the Ottoman harem has always shimmered with myth, Western imagination, fed by oil paintings and Orientalist fantasies, saw it as a paradise of perfumed courtyards and veiled seduction, where women lounged on cushions, fed grapes by handmaidens, and lived lives of luxurious idleness. But peel away the fantasy, and the silk unravels to reveal something far more harrowing. The harem was not a sanctuary. It was a system, a glittering machine of control, designed not to protect women, but to divide, discipline, and consume them. At its height, the harem housed not dozens, but sometimes hundreds of women, brought in from across 3 continents, captured in raids, bought in slave markets, or gifted as tributes by regional leaders, hoping to curry favor with the Sultan. These women came from vastly different worlds: Greek villages, Circassian mountains, Nubian deserts, Slavic plains, but once inside, they were stripped of identity, renamed in Turkish or Persian, and placed into a rigid hierarchy that measured their worth by appearance, obedience, and ability to captivate the Sultan's fleeting attention. They were not wives. Most never would be. They were concubines, their bodies owned by the imperial court, their fates decided by palace matrons and eunuchs, who served as both guardians and jailers. Their survival depended on their ability to play a game they never agreed to, a game of whispered rivalries, shifting alliances, and silent betrayals. To earn favor, they had to shine. To shine, they had to outshine the others. And so, The women were pitted against each other from the moment they entered. Every glance became a weapon. Every smile, a strategy. Every moment in the Sultan's presence, a battlefield disguised as dance. Some learned quickly, using beauty as leverage. Others relied on wit, musical skill, or mastery of court etiquette. But for every woman who rose to influence, there were many more who faded into silence. Their youth dimmed. Their usefulness expired. For these, the punishment was not death, but disappearance sent to outer palaces, sold to lesser nobles, or abandoned to brothels far from the glittering heart of Constantinople. Those who became pregnant and bore sons faced another gamble. Their child might one day rise to power, but only if he survived the web of palace politics, and only if the mother could shield him from the plots of other women vying for their own son's ascent. And there were darker realities still. Historical records speak of infants born in the harem and killed in secret, especially those of mixed heritage or uncertain paternity, lives extinguished, not out of cruelty alone, but because their existence complicated the imperial lineage. To the empire, even a baby's breath had political consequences. Beneath the silks and perfumes, fear governed everything. Fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, fear of saying the wrong word to the wrong eunuch. Even friendships were dangerous, seen as alliances that could threaten the balance of the harem's fragile hierarchy. Women smiled at each other by day and poisoned each other by night. And always, above them all, was the Sultan's mother, the Valide Sultan, whose power dwarfed them, whose word could raise a concubine to queen or reduce her to a servant with a single command. And yet, within this gilded cage, women fought not only to survive, but sometimes to rule. Some became patrons of architecture, literature, and law. Some influenced treaties and exiles, and even directed military campaigns from behind embroidered screens. But those stories, however extraordinary, should not distract us from the truth. Power for women in the Ottoman court was never granted freely. It was won through blood, beauty, and the slow erosion of the self. Next, we step beyond the palace walls into the public squares where justice was not blind, but theatrical, and where the empire turned punishment into performance, branding cruelty into the hearts of its people. Justice in the Ottoman Empire did not unfold behind closed doors or in hushed courtrooms. It did not speak in the solemn voice of judges or wear the veil of discretion. Instead, justice stepped into the sunlight, wrapped in spectacle, bold and deliberate, and marched straight into the town square, where it performed not for truth, but for power. Punishment in this empire was not a private reckoning. It was a ritual of fear, sharpened into performance, played out before the eyes of men, women, and children, until even mercy forgot how to look away. Accused criminals, especially those charged with moral, sexual, or political crimes, were not merely executed. That, in the empire's calculation, would have been too simple, too forgettable. Before death, there had to be humiliation. Before silence, there had to be a scream loud enough to echo across generations. The condemned were paraded, sometimes naked, sometimes shackled, always broken. They were displayed in cages or tied to stakes. And the public was not only invited, they were expected to gather. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts and sweet sherbets as if it were a festival. Parents hoisted children onto their shoulders to offer a better view. Some spectators wept. Others jeered. Most simply watched. What followed was often worse than execution. Records speak of punishments that were designed for maximum spectacle floggings that lasted hours. Mutilation done in sequence. Beheadings that failed once, twice, before succeeding, In certain cases, the condemned were tied to horses and dragged through city streets, their cries drowned out by the roars of the crowd. But perhaps most horrifying were the moments when the violence turned theatrical, when executioners dressed in costumes or used ceremonial weapons, when clerics chanted verses not to offer salvation, but to legitimize the pain. And these were not arbitrary acts. They were structured, scheduled, and in many cases, choreographed. Ottoman legal texts detail the procedures for various offences: how many lashes for adultery, how many limbs for treason, how many public hours before a thief was permitted to die. The message was clear and unrelenting: defy the empire, and your end will be written not in quiet, but in ritualized agony. But even in death, the body could not rest. Archaeological excavations have uncovered bones bearing marks of deliberate mutilation, fractures that occurred before death, carvings that served no medical purpose, post-mortem cuts that could only have been made for display. Not justice. These remains, unearthed century later, still scream, and they whisper something darker: that the empire did not simply kill to eliminate, but to teach. Every punishment was a story. Every broken limb was a warning. Every dismembered body was a symbol carefully placed into the architecture of fear. And so, cruelty was no longer an aberration. It was a civic language, woven into everyday life, presented markets, whispered in lullabies, and immortalized in poems that described the blade as both divine and necessary. It is said that some officials, before issuing sentences, would pause not to consider mercy, but to ensure the punishment would be memorable. This was not justice. It was indoctrination through blood. And yet, even this was not the full extent of the empire's design, because what truly made these horrors endure was not their brutality but their normalization. In the next part, we examine how these systems became culture, how power rewrote morality, and how generations were raised to see cruelty not as failure, but as order. This is not just the dark history of a fallen empire. It is a warning, one that whispers through time with a voice we would rather not hear. Because what happened in the Ottoman courts, in the slave markets, in the hidden chambers of palaces, was not the product of chaos. It was control. It was law. It was civilization turned inward, using its brilliance not to build, but to bind, to brand, to break. When power grows unchecked, when human dignity is reduced to inventory, when silence becomes the only language, victims are allowed to speak. The result is not just violence. The result is erasure of people, of memory, of the very idea that some lives are sacred. And when that erasure is passed from one generation to the next, it no longer lives in documents or dates. It lives in the quiet, in the gaps in family trees, in the stories no one tells, in the grief that arrives without a name. We like to think history ends when empires fall, but that is a myth. Empires crumble in stone long before they crumble in spirit. The systems they build, the hierarchies, the silences, the justifications outlive the sultans and soldiers who enforced them. They find new forms, new uniforms, new languages, and unless we name them, unless we remember, they return. The Ottoman Empire may be gone, but its scars are not. They live on in the fractured families of the Balkans, in the cultural absences of forgotten villages, in the inherited pain of those who don't know why they feel loss in their bones, and perhaps most of all, in the stories we still struggle to tell, stories of boys turned into tools, of women turned into currency, of a world that measured worth in silence. To remember is not to dwell. It is to resist, to tell the truth, even in fragments, is to begin to stitch humanity back into the places it was once torn out. And so we end not with condemnation, but with responsibility to see clearly, to speak carefully, and to never again confuse order with justice, or obedience with peace. Because history is not a closed book, it's a mirror, and what we choose to see, or not to see, will shape not only how we remember the past, but how we live in the present